Anyway, the church should not go by what a thing sounds like or what it seems. We already know that our gospel is offensive on many levels. And I think we do it a great disservice. And we do the people a great disservice for whom Christ died to shield them from this offense. The very offense that our Lord has arranged to save them. So the readings of the new lectionary are decidedly longer. And this, I think, is very important. And the reason for this is there's a lot of editorial stuff going on, business going on that surrounds the readings. And if we read just one little vignette or one little pericope, they say, like our example this morning of the Canaanite woman or the Syrophoenician woman, as Mark calls her, he's very specific about her, the fact that she's a Greek, which is she was a dog. That was their euphemism for the Greek, or the dog. Our exegesis or our interpretation or our understanding of the verse will be impoverished. But if we put the story of the Syrophoenician woman in a box and insulate it from everything that's gone before, then that's what we should expect. You're not going to see what Matthew, for example, in his version of it is trying to do if you don't see what's coming before and after. And we may even miss its primary meaning. Some folks maintain it doesn't really matter. The surrounding context doesn't have any importance, but the surrounding context is important. And without the surrounding context, our understanding of God's Word will be deeply impoverished, I think. And our spiritual growth, which feeds upon every word that comes out of the mouth of God, will be also deeply impoverished. And that will cascade into every other area of our lives. We need to know who's the author, who's his audience, why is he saying what he's saying, what place does it have in his overall work, his gospel, or is it his epistle in the case of the letters to the churches. Let me go back to the reading that I heard during one of our services. Read from, not this one this morning, but the one we heard from the ESV and from the longer lectionary. It was from St. John. It was from chapter 4, and the lectionary required the entire reading of the whole chapter, which wasn't just about the woman of the well, which is what chapter 4 primarily addresses. And that altered the way he actually delivered it. It was a little bit more spread out, and his guard was down. He wasn't so focused on the main idea of the chapter. He just read from beginning to the end. And there were some things that I heard that I'd never heard before, in terms of coming from the pulpit as far as someone reading that particular passage. It was about what John was doing with the story. Why is he telling us this story? Because the reading was longer and the reader was less focused on the story itself, I did hear some new things. See, let me just read you a paragraph and see if you can pick out something new. Now, when Jesus learned that the Pharisees had heard that Jesus was making and baptizing more disciples than John, although Jesus himself did not baptize, but only his disciples, he left Judea and departed again for Galilee. And he had to pass through Samaria. So he came to a town of Samaria called Sychar, near the field that Jacob had given to his son Joseph. Jacob's well was there. This is from the ESV, by the way. Jacob's well was there, so Jesus, wearied as he was from his journey, was sitting beside the well. It was about the 6th hour. There came a woman of Samaria to draw water. Jesus said to her, "Give me a drink," for his disciples had gone away into the city to buy food. The Samaritan woman said to him, "How is it that you, a Jew, ask for a drink from me, a woman of Samaria?" For Jews have no dealings with Samaritans. Did you hear anything new?
Yep.
What?
Jews have no dealings with Samaritans.
That's what I heard too. It's funny. And you know the reason why I heard it is because just the way he read it. Because there are 3 parentheses that occur in the Authorized Version actually has 2 of them, but they don't have the 3rd one. The 3rd parenthesis, so I sort of made it like a little aside, like if you're doing a play, the chorus takes a little aside to their audience, so it explains to the audience what's going on. And that's exactly what John is doing here, and he does it much, much more than Matthew, Mark, and Luke. So he gives these little asides. Now, if you were to step back and say, well, I didn't know that was an aside, I thought that was part of the dialogue, you would miss it entirely. Let me read it as if it were not part of a parenthesis, but actually part of the dialogue. "How is it you, a Jew, ask for a drink from me, a woman of Samaria? For Jews have no dealings with Samaritans." It could have been that way. But if you look at it linguistically, it's not that way. Now let's go back to it. "How is it that you, a Jew, ask for a drink of me, a woman of Samaria?" speaking to
John's
us.
telling us
It,
not the woman.
it tells it tells something completely different. John is attempting to maintain some clarity here. Okay, the first parenthesis was that Jesus didn't baptize. That was important too. We didn't talk about that. And this will be, and John feels it's important to put this in, and it's an important theological point in all of the four Gospels. John the Baptist and even Jesus' disciples baptized with water. Jesus will baptize with the Holy Ghost. It wouldn't make any sense if he was baptized with water. Number two, John inserts the editorial comment that his disciples had gone away into the city to buy meat or food. And this is important for this conversation to take place because Jesus' own apostles are not ready to hear this discussion. And although you might think they would, but they're not ready for the conclusion. And you can probably be pretty sure that John himself got this dialogue from the woman herself because there was nobody there to hear them if they were all off buying food. And number three, there's this John's editorial explanation of the woman's comment. For Jews have no dealings with Samaritans. And after the reading, I don't know why, but they just started talking about it. There were some other fellows there with us too. After the reading, we joked that how obvious it was that Jews had no dealings with Samaritans. But it's only funny if John is making the blunder of stating the obvious. And I thought about it for a minute, and I said, well, John's not making a blunder here. He's not stating the obvious because his audience does not necessarily know about this fanatical animosity that exists between the Jews and the Samaritans. So this is a primary clue about John's audience. John's audience is not the Jews. John's writing from Ephesus, we know that. And so is it more likely that he's writing to the Jews, the dispersed Jews, or the Greeks? And I think the editors of the English Standard Version probably suspected that it was indeed to the Greeks, because they put quotation marks in the text itself, and the Authorized Version doesn't.
Well, the Jews would know that they didn't deal with the Samaritans.
Exactly. So it's kind of dumb to just say that. So she could have been, again, if it were part of the text, of what she was saying, that she could have just been emphasizing the obvious, and that would have not disrupted the flow. But John's style is to use parenthetic expressions, and the ESV respects that and helps us in the translation. You could have gone one, and matter of fact, there's no punctuation in the Greek at all. So sometimes you do need some help. Well, does that go with that sentence, or does it go with the next sentence? And it really can make a difference sometimes, especially in Paul's epistles. There's no parentheses marks in the Greeks either. So as a translator, you really have to be sure about what you're doing when you stick these things into your translation. The woman would not be lecturing Jesus about not having any dealings with the Jews. But how often have we read this into the story? I know I have several times. Now, so let's go to the one that we read this morning, the Syrophoenician woman. What's going on here? Is Jesus being a bigot?
What's that?
We'll talk about it later.
Prejudice.
Prejudice. Just because a person is black or white or green or yellow or Syrophoenician, you don't like them. You don't like the way they walk. Matthew is very clear that Jesus repulses this woman 3 times. Number 1, Jesus gives her the silent treatment, which is disrespectful on the surface of it. Number 2, after the apostles complain about her annoying persistence, he says, I'm not sent to the lost. I'm not sent to anyone but the lost sheep of the house of Israel. And number 3, Jesus says, right to this woman's face, it's not right that I should take the children's bread and give it to the dogs. Whoever Matthew's audience might be, they must know that this is a cultural slur on purpose. A dog is a Gentile. Now, if we just live in this pericope and ignore what Matthew is doing, what he's done or what he might be doing, we're going to have a pretty hard time with this story. Did this woman just wear Jesus down with her persistence? Is faith then just blind determination? If any of these 2 things are true, then we've got a real problem, because Jesus then is a common bigot. And that cascades into several theological problems. Back in the 60s, they dealt with this. And if he is a bigot, bigot that impacts his deity. Really, Jesus would have a difficult time being God if he were just a common bigot, just inherit these prejudices from his nurturing. And I have heard commentators struggling with this very text because of this supposed bigotry, in isolation from everything else, attempting to minimize Jesus' cultural chauvinism. Oh, the word just means little dogs. But it doesn't really matter if you're calling a Gentile a dog or a little dog. It really doesn't. So, there's something much larger going on here than cultural chauvinism. And if you're reading it right from the lectern, you can convey that. There is definitely some irony going on here in the text. Matthew has deliberately taken the audience just over the border of Israel into Tyre and Sidon. They're not even supposed to be there, but that Jesus goes there to meet a woman from Canaan. The word is kananaios, so it's not some Aramaic word. It's a Greek word. It's a Greek adaptation in Matthew. So Matthew's not writing to the Jews either. He's writing to the Greek. At least he's not primarily writing to the Jew. He's looking past what he knows will be a superficial, non-comprehending, non-receiving Jewish audience to a larger Gentile audience. Yes, he is less familiar with that audience than John and John Mark, but he's nevertheless aiming at them. He says at the end, O woman, great is thy faith. Be it unto thee even as thou wilt. This is from the AV. And her daughter was made whole from that very hour. If Matthew were writing to the Jews, he could have easily left out this praise of faith of a Gentile dog. But then he'd also have to leave out the embarrassing story of the Roman oppressor whose servant was healed, which immediately follows this story. Surely he could have at least left out what Jesus said to him, which was excruciatingly embarrassing to the Jews. Quote, when Jesus heard it, he marveled and said to them that followed, verily I say unto you, I have not found so great faith, no, not in Israel. No, Matthew's doing this on purpose. And we could go on and on to show this. Matthew is not writing primarily to the Jews, except in judgment. Matthew is writing to the Gentiles too, just like John. It's not persistence that saved the Syrophoenician woman's daughter. Jesus has set this whole thing up to demonstrate that what motivated this woman was something else. She was certain that Jesus could heal her daughter. That's clear from the text. The leper, remember the leper that was cured when he came down the mountain after the transfiguration? The leper knew that if Jesus wanted to, he could make him clean. And that's what the leper says to him. If you want to, you can make me clean. Do you think you can? If you want to, you can make me clean. The centurion knew that Jesus didn't even have to come into his house to cure his servant. He could just speak the word and it would be done. And the men, remember the men who broke up the tiles and let the man down through them? They don't do that because, well, it might happen. He might cure them. They knew that they were forcing Jesus' hand. They plopped this paralyzed man right in front of Jesus in this crowded room. And the hemorrhaging woman knew that one illegal, unclean touch would cure her. Blind Bartimaeus throws off his cloak as he goes to be healed by Jesus because he knows he's never going to return to his roadside begging booth. He knew it. These people were not motivated by enthusiasm or desperation or maybe or probable. These people were motivated by belief. In John, Jesus has an extended discussion about Jesus being the bread of heaven. Jesus says, I am the bread of life. Your fathers did eat manna in the wilderness and are dead. This is the bread which comes down from heaven, that a man may eat thereof and not die. I am the living bread which came down from heaven. If any man eat of this bread, he shall live forever. And the bread that I will give is my flesh, which I will give for the life of the world. And the Jews reject this bread. And this is why Jesus says that it's just ain't fitting to give the Jews bread to the Gentiles. And yet, he does. Because the Syrophoenician woman represents all of us, the whole world. And she says, if you're not going to eat that, I will. She says, evermore give me this bread of eternal life. And And the very next story in Matthew is the feeding of the 4,000. And in Matthew, the disciples ask, where are we going to get as much bread we need in the wilderness to fill so great a multitude? And it's a question the Syrophoenician woman would have never asked.